There's a wonderful moment in the wake of a major event where the dust has settled and everyone's gone home, but the afterglow of meeting people and seeing friends you haven't seen in a year remains, and your mind is buzzing with ideas and possibilities about what the next thing to explore is. CanCon 2026 was a fantastic time, and in the week and a bit since that event, I've been reading and writing and talking to people and sharing lists. And this is a video about that and flying vehicles. So, what are we talking about? Chiefly, we'll be covering 4 lists that I've written and I'm excited for since CanCon. I want to play all of these. I haven't played any of them yet. You may be able to tell from my voice that I have a touch of the con rot. And all of these lists are to an extent experimental, but test things that I want to try. As it's happened, the first 2 of these first lists will feature and therefore be used to discuss vehicles, which I've seen a little bit of discourse about on the big Discord, and which appear to be currently subject to the balance complaint of the month, and so are worth looking at in lists and thinking and talking about. The second 2 lists don't feature flyers, but I am excited for them and I think they're neat, and so we'll talk in passing about how they might be situated in a flyer metagame and how they'll defend against incoming aerials. Chiefly though, this video is just a chance for me to catch my breath a bit after CanCon and enjoy that period of enthusiasm that doesn't have any of the accompanying pressure of an impending event. Call it post-CanCon clarity, if you will. So, why vehicles? Well, the short answer is that a couple of people who I know and who like to needle me have sent me links to Discord comments from people saying that vehicles are auto-includes in lists now, and I am a creature motivated by productive contrarianism. But if we peel back that particular layer, we can actually see an emerging metagame where vehicles are going to become more and more important to think about. As vehicle models become physically available to every faction, now that every vehicle apart from the Haytham has a physical model for people to use. And as the community catches up with the effects of the October changes and explores them and deploys them in events, we should absolutely expect to see vehicles become more frequent in more lists. And with a good few months now since the October update, we are entering that stage of the meta development where people are getting good at using and feeling out the power of these pieces, but we're not all yet particularly good at defending against vehicles. And this is a phenomenon I've discussed on the channel previously. You have that red deck wins phase, where one of the necessary preconditions of learning how to defend against something is to learn the maximum extent to which something can be used against you. But in that environment, it's producing some very reasonable experiences from people where a vehicle performs very, very well, and someone goes, wow, that was strong as hell. Is this class of model overpowered? Now, probably not, but we do need to think about them in our lists and start thinking about the metagame that's coming. Why are vehicles good, and what do we do about that? I've got a video about vehicles that I would basically refer you back to for a broader discussion of them, but in short, vehicles are a volatile class of unit with a high floor but a low ceiling. The worst performance for vehicles can materialize with surprising regularity because they are a fragile, somewhat expensive class of unit that has a very large silhouette and which can't claim cover. What that means is that the worst case scenario for a vehicle is that it can't hide anywhere, it gets seen, and it gets killed relatively quickly, which particularly for the more expensive vehicles can be kind of an issue. However, that risk, if you can manage it, is accompanied by a pretty commensurate reward because the ceiling, right, the upper limit for the amount you can get out of a vehicle is very, very high. If they are left unchecked, or if a vulnerability in your opponent's defenses emerges, vehicles are one of the best units in the game at just getting kills on almost anything. Because they are so mobile, they have such a long leash per order, and they are so capable of delivering plunging fire that, for example, they can get to and then buzz your deployment zone basically with impunity if you aren't able to stop them. This makes them an excellent class of model at firstly just punishing null deployments. If your defense is just to hide, then a vehicle is 2 or 3 orders away from fighting whatever in your deployment zone it wants. And secondly, as a game passes, as time passes in a game, and defenses fray and your positions get unpicked, vehicles are very good at exploiting vulnerabilities that emerge. When a breach is created or a gap emerges in defenses, a vehicle is never more than a couple of orders away from being in position to take advantage of them. And this makes them a really powerful class of unit that is 100% worth thinking about how we use, but then also thinking about how we get ahead of the metagame in which other people are using them. What makes them strong? And my position is that what makes them strong is that they impose a defensive debt on the reactive player, right? You have to defend against vehicles. Because you have to defend against vehicles, and it is absolutely possible to do so, that changes how the game has to be played, and we can get ahead of that. And so in this video, we're kind of going to be thinking about three things as we go through these four lists that I'm excited to play. The first is just how do we make use of vehicles in our lists? The second is how do we defend against vehicles that other people are going to be using? And the third, and this is kind of important, how do we capitalize on how people defend against vehicles? And how do we fit our lists into the metagame that's going to emerge as more people get their hands on these physical models, put them in their lists, play with them, and then learn how to make good use of them. So our first list is a vanilla Yuching list experimenting with the Faikwan. Almost certainly mispronouncing that, but that's how we do on this channel. And this list is the reason why this is a video in large part talking about flyers, rather than just a video talking about lists I'm excited to play post CanCon. This list was written after someone directed me to some discussion on the Yuching section of the main Infinity Discord, where there was a contention that was made that the Faikwan was an auto-include. Now, personally, I'm very willing to take that statement for the Discord discourse that it was, which is to say a solid dash of hyperbole to make a point in a fast-moving conversation. But it did get me thinking. Now, do I think the Faikwan is an auto-include? No, not personally. But the more I look at it, the more interesting that it is. I ranked the Faikwan as the least powerful, in my personal opinion, of any of the vehicles, and while I do think I stand by that, certainly in a vacuum, it is really worth thinking about how the model fits into the context of the broader faction. And one of the things that I didn't really think about when I was assessing this is the extent to which a Faikwan can kind of be considered as a very cheap fill-in for the Sujan. The Sujan is one of the most dangerous rapid offensive units in the game. It is incredibly durable. If it gets to your lines and breaches those lines and you don't, for example, have a hacking defense to stop it, it can cause tremendous damage. And while a Faikwan, for example, is much less durable and harder to hide in your reactive turn, it can do kind of a comparable amount of damage for relatively fewer points. And if you take a Yuching list that was trying to fit a Sujan and you cut it for a model that is much cheaper, you get all sorts of options in play. And so what we have here from the top, a few other things, by the by, that are experimental. All of these lists will have things that I'm willing to try out. Many of these concepts might end up morphing back into a more normal list. But for now, 2 combat groups, 9 troopers and 6 troopers, but with some access to things like multiple tactical awareness orders in the second combat group to spread that out. In practice, making this a very healthy 9-8 order split. We're starting with the Faikwan. This is the X-Visor multi-rifle +1 burst profile. The reason for that is the other Faikwan profile, although it's very interesting and very techy, it doesn't have any lethal weapons. I want this model in this list to be able to exploit gaps in suppressed enemy defenses and go and kill things, and I can't do that with an EM carbine, as cool as a +1 special dice pitcher is. So we have the lethally armed multi-rifle +1 version, X-Visor version of the Faikwan. Then we have a Xian Warrior Lieutenant. Part of the idea with this list is that we want to be able to aggressively suppress enemy active turn defenses, and that might include things like, for example, total reaction bots, which a smoke shooting Xian warrior is very good at putting down. Now, we have a little bit of a plan for concealing his identity, which I'll talk to in a moment, but we are running no chain of command. We do have 3 Warhorse troops, which can help manage loss of lieutenant. It's a risk this list is running. Part of what this list is doing is being experimental. We then have a Mawang NCO Disco Ball Red Fury Hideout duo. I really like this team. It's incredibly high utility. It makes use of NCO if the Xian warrior doesn't need to spend his lieutenant order. It gets the hideout into the midfield to do specialist stuff and make assault actions with its boarding shotgun. It controls visibility. Yes, there's no duo bonuses, but these 2 models just play very, very nicely together. It's one of the best duos you can build in vanilla Yuching just from a utility perspective. We've then got the first of 2 Shaolin monks. Both of them happily are able to afford DACWs in this list. And then we have a big-ass minefield. We're running the Zensha Mine Layer 2, the Libertos Mine Layer, and then 2 Gudans. What that's going to give us are 3 Mimetism 0 camouflage markers and 4 Mimetism 3 camouflage markers, which we will use to build a deep defensive system and provide some defense in depth kind of as the crumple zone before our deployment zone. If this list has to answer the question of how the hell do I defend against an incoming flyer, part of the answer to that question is the Gudan Zappers, which, if they reveal to Zapper, force a dodge response from a flyer. Now, we can also use one of those Zench's mines as a very cheeky lieutenant decoy. Because we've rolled willpower 14 on our LT in this list, many opponents are going to default to assuming that we're going to be playing a Dao Ying lieutenant. Very good reason to do so. Dao Ying are excellent LTs. And so they'll be looking for a Mimetism 3 camouflage marker in our deployment zone. If we give them one, they might see what they expect to see, and hopefully make some decisions that perhaps are ill-considered or depend on the assumption that there is a hacker back there in the deployment zone who is our lieutenant and who is hard to reach. Now, against a very canny opponent, if they're very familiar with the faction, the fact that I'm running 15 troops with so many mine layers is likely to provoke a little bit of thought and maybe unpick the puzzle, but it's a funny idea I thought I would at least try, which I've gone and ruined now by talking about it. In our second combat group, we have the Hete AP Heavy Machine Gun, Tactical Awareness. Had I the point spare, I would make this into a Yanho. I tend to prefer Yanho just a little bit over the Hete. The +1 burst is one thing, but the immunity armor is another. A Hete is just, it's slightly less reliable, albeit still very good. But it's cheaper, and one of the things we're doing in this list is trying to cram as much stuff in possible by cutting corners in certain places. The Faikwan is a very discount Sujan in this list, and the Hete is a discount Yanho. The second combat group is rounded out by a Weibing Yaokong, Tactical Awareness, a second sensor to accompany the Faikwan if you need it. More importantly though, it's just a fast tactical awareness specialist, which in many cases is something this list will want. We have a second Shaolin Monk, a Longwang. The Longwang pilot in this particular case, we've picked the Longwang because it's the one that's most likely to do something. What we actually need is just the cheapest model we can find with a gizmo kit. One of the big weaknesses of vehicles is that they are very vulnerable to hacking or electromagnetic rounds. Basically, any of those states, isolated, immobilized, that can be afflicted by EM or hacking, bricks them in the air, and you need a gizmo kit to recover that. You can't, for example, use a disco ball because you can't get into base contact with the bastards. And so if we want to make maximum use of the Faikwan, hey, it's a 10-point regular order. It's very much essential. Finally, 7-point flashbot, 8-point baggage bot. The 8-point baggage bot is very useful in this list since we have some important deployables, notably the disco ball on the Moang and the pitcher on the Hideout. And so the overall plan here is really pretty straightforward. It's a very Yuching kind of plan. We're going to have some good, solid, quality guns. The Xian Warrior, the Moang, and the Heite all give different kinds of relatively long-range firepower that we can use to suppress enemy positions. If there's hackers that we're worried about, we can go after them with the Hideout, although there's very much an upper limit to what I would try and fight with that Hideout. But anything like a blocker or a Fusilier hacker that's just projecting some deployment zone hacking out of things like Fugazi drone bots, very happy to engage that. And then once those defenses are suppressed, we do one of two things. If there is a clear run with the Faikwan, we send it in, we do a bunch of damage, we kill things. If there's not, we have all of these skirmishing elements to make probing jab attacks. We can move in with Shaolin Monks with the Libertos, chip away at enemy defenses and positions, trade so that their defensive setup frays so that in time an opportunity to strike a decisive blow with the Faikwan emerges. If that never emerges, if your opponent's defenses stay tight the entire game, we just play the scenario. We play much more traditionally, we play a relatively normal attrition game, and hey, the Faikwan was 27 points, there'll be something for it to kill at some point. Worst case scenario, it moves into midfield and goes into suppressive fire, and hopefully absorbs a bunch of attention. It's a relatively low investment, it's 27 points, it's 0 SWC, and I'm kind of excited to play it, because it genuinely was the vehicle that I considered to be the weakest, and the multi-rifle profile was the one I gave the least thought to. But in this list, in this role, it seems kind of interesting. So this is the first of these lists that I'm excited to play. I do think it would benefit enormously from a little bit of actual defensive hacking presence. And there's a pretty reasonable chance that that mine layer Zencha eventually gets cut, but that model is on the list of things that I want to try, so it's in the list for now, even if, yeah, eventually maybe it actually becomes the Dao Ying hacker, maybe it becomes a Zencha hacker, they're very good, depending on what I find I need in terms of the defensive setup in this list as the metagame moves forward. The second list that we're looking at today goes even further in on this idea of flyers. And there's really only one faction that can do that, and that's Haqqislam, vanilla Haqqislam, because in vanilla Haqqislam, we have access to not one, but two different flyer profiles. And they're both pretty damn good, and they complement each other very nicely. And so what we're doing in this list is we're playing double flyers, but then we are building a list around that in a way that is designed to do actually some really aggressive suppression of enemy air defense kind of stuff, and really violently open the way for a turn one attack with these pieces if the option at all exists. Unlike the Yuching list, where we have the Faikwan in there just to present threat and capitalize on it if needed, this list goes, no, I'm going to knock down your door and strafe your deployment zone on turn one, and these are the tools I'm going to use to do it. So we begin with Saladin because this is a Haqqislam list. Not only is he very good generally, but the reserve options, for example, reserve deploying both vehicles, or some other pieces we're more likely to use, very, very good. He gives us the best possible chance of going first, which this list will often want to do. And then subtly but very importantly, he lets us move our combat groups around really easily. And if we're looking to create and exploit a breach in our opponent's defenses and then dive them with a flyer, we potentially really need that flexibility in groups. Now, this is something I expect to change as this list gets refined. I will adjust and alter these groups and figure out what needs to go where. For now, they are set up in a somewhat generic kind of way, with the expectation that I'm very likely to flick something into Combat Group 2 from Combat Group 1 as early as the first turn. I find that as you play Saladin lists more and more, you get an idea for what needs to move where when, and you end up with very refined groups that have a kind of clear plan for one of a couple of things moves into Group 2 on the first turn. I haven't played this yet, so I don't have that clear plan, but I'm making space for it, if that makes sense. So, Saladin, Zabek, and a Haytham. These two are some of my favorite flyers, and they complement each other really nicely. The Zabek has Albedo, which is the only flyer that does. It's got Albedo and ballistic skill attack -3. That means it's very good at killing, or at least engaging and suppressing, the kind of pieces that would cause the Haytham to struggle. The Haytham has MSV and Mimetism -6. Those two just have a really nice firepower mix. The Haytham incidentally happens to be one of the best anti-flyer flyers in the game. If this, for example, plays into the Yuching list that we just talked about, and it goes first, you are almost certainly going to kill the Faikwan early in turn 1 because of how good the Haytham is at putting down pieces like that. Ultimately, it doesn't particularly matter which of these two gets to the enemy and kills them on the first turn. Both of them are capable, and I've absolutely had games using the Zabek in the past where my opponent might have had nothing with an MSV or marksmanship in their deployment zone, but it was in position to move and engage, and it has ballistic skill attack -3 and AP rounds, and it's tough, and so it did the job. We've then got Zuleika. If I can, I like to have both biker twins in a list. In this case, couldn't afford it. That's totally fine. If we only have one biker twin, we take the good one. We've then got a Shakush pilot for exactly the same reason that the Long Wang pilot is in the previous list. Sometimes you need a gizmo kit, and in this case, with two vehicles, we 100% need a gizmo kit. Now, from here, we get a little bit blast from the past, and this is something that's pretty likely to change about the list in future. We're running the Nauf Azrael firepower setup just because I was kind of nostalgic for it. This is a pretty dated setup at this point. It's something that I used in N4, and just because something was good in N4 does not mean it's good in N5. But there's a little bit of a hope with this list that basically we are spending 6 SWC on guns, guns, and guns, and there's enough of a firepower mix there that Nauf and the Azrael only need to do as much heavy lifting as they're capable of. These are a very diverse set of guns. We've got an AP Spitfire with Albedo, a Red Fury with continuous damage mimetism and an MSV1, a Sniper with mimetism and an MSV1 and surprise, and then an Azrael with just a buck cannon. And so the hope is that basically with this diverse set of firepower, I should be able to do a good job of engaging whatever I want in the enemy defenses, put that down, and then proceed with the rest of the plan. We've then got a Warcore, it's 3 points and regular, and then there are 3 Matalia split across the 2 groups. A bunch of different profiles here, boarding shotgun, jammer, smoke, jammer and chain rifle, and then in combat group 2, smoke grenades and chain rifle. I want some of these to be capable of throwing smoke, and ideally I want as many of them as possible having jammers. 2 is kind of the bare minimum here, and those jammers are very important because like the previous list, we don't have any reactive turn hacking defenses. We do have a very good hacker, but she's a killer hacker and she's in this list for a very dedicated purpose. We've then got a Haqqislam Fede. Now, just to talk about Hunzakut, Forward Observer, Specialist, Midfield, excellent. Gulam Doctor with an Azmat, cheap Doctor. It's part of the firepower package where you take Nauf and an Azrael. She'll get cut if I cut Nauf and the Azrael for something else. For example, we could put in an Odalisk Janissary fire team, would cost pretty similar points. You can even run this kind of list running something like a tag. You can actually fit a Magariba Guard. One of the versions of this list that I have played features 2 vehicles and a Magariba. I played it against Next Wave, and it turns out Next Wave really doesn't like it when you kill every fire team master in their list on the first turn, for example. Now, the interesting kind of spice that we have here, in addition to an old school firepower mix and these 2 vehicles, is in that Fede and the Tuareg, because what we're really looking to do, especially with this second combat group, is ruin the day of the defenses our opponent might use to stop those flyers. And so the Fede is a scalpel piece against whatever we need. Very likely she'll be going in against something like an enemy hacker. And then complementing that, we have the Tuareg Killer Hacker. Now, at 28 points, the Tuareg KHD is a piece I've used a few times in the past, and it kind of sucks when she doesn't have a use case beyond being a specialist. You really do want to bring that KHD to bear, because otherwise she's just a submachine gun. But if you can find her target, even if she just walks from the halfway line to the enemy deployment zone herself, she's really one of the scariest KHDs for cost in the game. She has surprise attack, she brings her own firewall, and she's a whopping willpower 15, which means that she can always get unlucky, but very few enemy hackers are comfortable having her walk into their zone of control. And so in combination with the Fede, she rounds out basically infiltration and sabotage pieces that will move forward or begin very close to the enemy and take out those few specific things that might be linchpin elements in the defense against flyers, to then enable the guns to just go through normal suppression of enemy air defense kind of pieces where they just put down things like total reaction bots. I can just kill those with almost any of these weapons, and then really dive with the vehicles, potentially doing a tremendous amount of damage. Now, this is a very theoretical list idea, and it's frankly pretty frighteningly contingent on going first, but it's intended to demonstrate what might be possible in terms of just hard forcing flyer success. This is the kind of list that I would expect to be very good at going 4 and 1, but not 5 and 0 at a big event, because unlike the 0 SWC 27-point Faikwan, if you lose either or both of the Zabek and the Haytham on the first turn, you are down a huge amount of capability and might really struggle to find your way back into the game. And if you go second and there aren't good places to hide 2 flyers, then you're left trying to figure out which of them is more valuable, making the Sophie's choice, and hoping the other dodges well enough to suck down your opponent's first turn worth of orders. And that kind of confluence of bad luck tends to emerge at least once over the course of a 5-round event. But I also expect a list exactly like this to be the kind of list that someone plays against just once in a casual game, and then proceeds pretty immediately to the Discord to go, guys, is double flyers overpowered? Because the high watermark for this list is absolutely going to feel that way. Now, our third list is a brief departure from this discussion of flyers, because as a reminder, this is chiefly a video about lists that I'm excited for post-CanCon, which just happens to include a bunch of discussion about flying vehicles, and is in fact a list that I would not have written at all if not for some questions that got asked of me of a friend who's feeling out getting into Infinity. And this is the kind of person who will always, under any circumstances, attempt to subvert the core dynamic of whatever game they play. In Conquest, a game about rank and flank and melee and the press of pike, they are currently running a list that is almost entirely ranged spellcasting. And in Kill Team, and now in Infinity, having been told this is a game about gunfighting and cover, they have expressed an interest in, well, how would it be possible for me to just stab my opponents repeatedly to death? And because they are also a massive weeaboo, I've been talking to them about Shindenbutai. Now, fair is fair. This is very much just a Shindenbutai list. Shindenbutai is a faction that tends to default back to a fairly consistent baseline, and there aren't going to be a lot of surprises in here for any long-term Shindenbutai players. However, I am a faction butterfly, and it means that myself as a tourist can come in and play this and be like, oh wow, that was super cool and awesome, because the baseline Shindenbutai list is really, really cool. So what are we playing with here? We are playing with a 9-6 split with a few irregulars, no tactical awareness, but we have a Lieutenant +1 order and an NCO, both of whom are liable to be spending those orders. We start with a Tanuki Haris team, Chain of Command Tanuki, Hacker Tanuki, and a Shizoku, and we're trying to get a little bit of efficiency here by not taking the Matsuke officer, and instead, to get our fire team bonuses, we have the Tanuki Hacker, who is just an outstanding faction-defining profile, and the Tanuki Chain of Command, who is relatively cheap at 18 points. Not awful on its merits, and gives us the duo bonuses, both for that hacker, so we've got duo bonuses on the pitcher and the disco baller, and on the Shizoku, who is a very capable firepower piece, but does like going up to that 4th dice offensively. This is just a good and well-rounded fire team. We don't intend to expose it to terribly much danger. It is possible that the Shizoku will at some point trigger Frenzy, run off and stab something. It's very able to do that. Or it might just operate in a fire support role for much of the game, making sure that the chain of command stays safe, because our lieutenant is going to be exposed to danger in this case. And our lieutenant is one of 2 Hatamotos. We have an Hatamoto NCO Red Fury and a Hatamoto Lieutenant Red Fury. Now, something to note about the fire teams in Shindenbutai is this looks like it might be meant to duo, it can't. If you want to have Hatamoto in the same fire team, that has to be a Bushutai fire team, which needs a Jizumurai, and I'm not interested in putting one of those in my list if I can avoid it. They're not terrible, they're okay, but they do things that I don't need doing when I have 2 Hatamotos. And actually, the more I thought about it, the more I was very comfortable with the idea of deploying those 2 Hatamoto on widely different parts of the battlefield and just activating whichever of them is more useful in any given turn. Both of them have access to the full order pool of the group, plus the 2 lieutenant orders. And provided I'm supporting them with disco balls from one of 2 Tanuki teams, they're basically fire teams in a can. They are specialist operative, they have a burst 4 gun, and they are deadly as hell in melee, and they're very good at gap closing. In fact, look, I would prefer to have Spitfires over Red Furies, but as long as I've got the Red Fury on each of these, I have a burst 4 gun, and that burst 4 gun is basically a gap closing tool. I will comfortably take a 4 dice shot against a Jotun, which I can't physically hurt, just in the interest of getting into close combat, because once you are in close combat, there's almost nothing in the game that a Hatamoto can't realistically take down. They have a massive CC score, and Martial Arts 4, and Natural Born Warrior, which means that they are very much high watermark in terms of combat. And as a reminder, this is a list that was built for a person who wants to stab things in this game about gunfighting. I am excited to play these guys. I've only played a little bit of Shindenbutai, and when I did, most of what I did was just play with the Tanukis because they're my kind of piece, but this list is going to really force me to use those premium heavy infantry, cross the board, and stab a fool. We've then got a Kyojin Killer and a Yamabushi. We'll see that same camouflage setup mirrored in Combat Group 2. These are very good pieces. I do think if I was to refine this list, I would seriously evaluate whether or not I actually need 2 Kyojin and 2 Yamabushi. Particularly in Combat Group 1, I think there's a little bit of a risk, for example, that maybe the Kyojin is redundant with the other assault pieces that exist, but for now it's in there because it's good value and dangerous, and I like it. We've then got a Robo Bot and a Baggage Bot, regular orders, and this is a list in which baggage is very, very important. Combat Group 2, we've then got a Guided Missile Launcher. Not necessarily essential, but since we have 2 good quality pitchers and 2 decent quality hackers, we may as well put it in the lists. Second Kyojin Killer, second Yamabushi. A Monstrucker, this is one of the pieces that would probably get cut as the list refines, but we are running a bunch of heavy infantry, and we're running Arushi, who may well take an active turn gunfight at some point, and so being able to recover that has some utility. Otherwise, the Monstrucker is just contributing to most of what this combat group is going to do, which is occasionally fling a Kyojin Killer forward, but otherwise go and just spew deployables out everywhere. In any given turn, we could easily, without reloading, throw out disco balls and pitchers and mine dispensers and the drop bears, and then have all of those models loot the baggage bot for reloads, and that's something that I really like being able to do. Now, ultimately, the Monstrucker's drop bears are a little bit redundant given we have that Rushi, but it can be in marginally different parts of the table, it can move forward, it's relatively expendable, it's a specialist. I'm not really hurting for those in this list, but I have had value out of 12-point Monstruckers in the past. But I do think, again, as we refine this list down, the Monstrucker is something that might get cut. If I could find any points anywhere, maybe we get in something like Yojimbo. Overall, though, the goal of this list is mostly to get into close combat and kill things while having all of the other tools that it needs to do all of the things in Infinity that I like. Now, since this is a video where we spend a bunch of time discussing flyers, how does this list deal with flyers? And it's an example of a list that really does have particularly a close-in defense that should be reasonably effective at stalling out flyers. If we need a large, like a long ARO, we have the Shizoku, but I'm not super keen to use it for that. This list is mostly going to null deploy, but the terminal approach against this list can be very dangerous to encounter. And that's because we have 4 camouflage markers, 2 of which conceal models with heavy flamethrowers. A heavy flamethrower definitely prompts a dodge response from any flyer that gets caught in it. If you imagine like an armor 3 flyer passing through a heavy flamethrower, is a very good chance of going straight to dead. And against flyers, we'll actually pull those camouflage markers back so that they are underneath the envelope provided by all of the repeaters in this list. We've got 3 deployment zone repeaters, plus the hackers themselves. That should give us ample coverage, and each of those repeaters projects the hacking network of 2 hackers, which means it's not just 1 carbonite that a flyer might have to endure, it's 2. And when you have a flyer that is moving through at the same time the arrow of a flamethrower and 2 carbonites, that's a flyer that's about to have a very, very bad time. In practice, that means that lists that are designed to suppress enemy defenses have to deal with all of those things first, and especially the Kyojin killers are difficult to unpick and are our last line of defense. And then finally, we do have centers of strength that can be a little bit difficult for vehicles to pin down. Hatamoto are a model that don't themselves love fighting vehicles because you cannot unfairly stab a vehicle. But a vehicle does not much like fighting a Hatamoto either. Vehicles really rely, in terms of like getting the most out of their damage, of taking gunfights where nobody has cover. One of the big things a vehicle can do is just zoom out to be directly overhead, fire down on you, and at that point, no one has cover, so its no cover rule doesn't matter, but it's benefiting, for example, from mimetism -6. Hatamoto, for their part, don't just have mimetism, they have nanoscreens, which means it can be very difficult for a vehicle to really scalpel out the center of strength in this list. Now, do we want vehicles to be buzzing our Hatamoto? No, I know from experience that given enough time, a vehicle can kill a Hatamoto. But we are at least in a position where if the enemy engages us, and for example, we play against that Haqqislam list, and in the first few orders of the game, maybe they're able to deal with 1 Tanuki, and then after a bit of movement, they get the killer hacker forward, and then eventually she deals with the other, and there are some orders left for vehicles to begin an attack run, we can be in a position where, okay, it might take 2 orders for the vehicle to close, and your opponent budgets 2 orders for the vehicles to retreat, or 3 orders for the vehicle to retreat. We can at least nominally expect to survive the worst of the damage one of those vehicles might do, because the pieces they're looking to kill are difficult to strafe from the air. Overall, though, this is a list that I'm just excited to play because it would be a return to Shindenbutai for me, and a chance to make a bunch of use of the Hatamoto Imperial Guard, which are awesome and super interesting profiles and kind of unlike most other things in the game, and which I've played against plenty, but never had a ton of chance to use myself. And finally, we have this Combined Army list. Now, Combined Army are a faction that I've wanted to go and spend a little bit of time with basically for the entirety of N5 so far, but I knew that I would need some time, and that deadline kind of got pushed back again post-October, because the Combined Army absolutely copped a bunch of nerfs in the October update. Now, these were absolutely not terminal. It is still a very powerful, very capable faction, but what it meant is that I would have needed even more time to distance myself from my memory of the faction in N4. Because if you try and take the kind of list that I was running in N4, double aspect lists, for example, Charontiid and Anathematic, they just don't translate as well into N5 anymore, even though those pieces are individually really, really powerful, because the supporting infrastructure to pad out to 15 troopers really easily and still have a complete list is just a little bit more difficult to access. And so this is basically just a return to first principles, discard existing wisdom. What do I end up with? And I'm really kind of excited for the result. It wasn't exactly the intention, but this has ended up being a list that I think potentially has some of the tools to deal very effectively with certain things in the coming metagame, and which has some very good gunfighting options against pieces I want to have good gunfighting against. And so we're starting with Sheshkin. Now, Did we put Sheshkin in this list because I spent a bunch of time immediately previously thinking about Hadamoto Imperial Guards and really cool close combat models with nanoscreens are awesome? Maybe. But she's also one of the cheapest lieutenants in Vanilla Combined Army that can absolutely still put the game on her back if need be. Sheshkin can go on an absolute tear. She's differentiated from Hatamoto by having a much higher watermark in terms of lethality and the damage she can do, because she's a model with Prothean. However, she isn't a specialist, so she is purely an aggressive danger piece, but she's fun as hell to play under those circumstances. By taking her, rather than a more expensive aspect, we free up actually like 20 something points. We still get an incredibly potentially dangerous lieutenant, and then we can fit kind of more mid-range stuff into a list that gets us into these things that I'm kind of keen and excited for. And we start with a duo. A utility duo does not have fire team bonuses, but two models that complement each other in very interesting ways. An Overdrawn Plasma Sniper and Victor Mesa. Now, Mesa is one of the models that was added in, I think, in October to Combined Army, previously NN5 having been restricted to Shaz Vasti. And he's one of the silver linings of the update for this faction, because he's really good. In addition to being one of the Human Sphere's most canonically virulent shitposters, he's an almost perfect hacker in terms of like things that I like being able to do. He just natively has 2 wounds, he's got BTS 3, and he has the incredible profile of Hacking Device Plus with Damage 5 Trinity and 0 Pain, which is just like, that's amazing. Like, that is so good. There are no weaknesses to that. That is the best hacking device in the entire game. You have good active turn offensive hacking, you have all of the utility tools that you might want, and you have 0 pain for defense. And in this list, he's duoed with the Overdrawn. Now, he won't stay duoed with the Overdrawn the entire game, but the Overdrawn can use its tactical awareness order to push him forward if need be. And in the meantime, the Overdrawn has a Tinbot, which means if you try and go after Victor in your active turn, you are contending with BTS 3, Firewall, Willpower 14, 2 wounds, and 0 pain. The very strongest hackers in the game can still put him down, but not reliably. Even something like Deferson or an Anathematic could have their entire turn just kind of fail attempting to go after him. And that tickles me enormously. On top of all of that, he's good at moving into the midfield. He's a great specialist for just trolling around pieces in the midfield. He has a nano screen. He can enter into a marker state because he's got a hacking device plus, and he has a serviceable enough profile for fighting in the midfield. He's a specialist. If you discover him as he's moving forward, you take emitter at active turn fighting. He's got decharges, and on top of all of those things, he comes with the utility of being a Mine Layer 2 profile with his choice of Cyber Mines and deployable repeaters. In this list, we will usually use the Cyber Mines because we have a very, very nice deployment zone repeater coverage, like some of the best in the game. But if need be, we could butt off a second deployable repeater from him if we thought we really needed it. I have a huge amount of time for this guy. I'm very excited to play him, and part of why I'm excited to play him is if I play into an MSV or Marksmanship ARO piece, Albedo stacks with White Noise, which means that if I'm playing against Next Wave and my opponent puts Chusa up on a rampart somewhere, I am not forced to feed him 3 more mayors, just to pick an example completely at random. Instead, I get to stack -12 invisibility mods onto that motherfucker and light him up with a plasma sniper. And that is something that brings joy to the cockles of my heart and is part of what this list is doing. It doesn't have that many active turn guns. Realistically, it's got 3, but those guns are intending to stack visibility modifiers up to the point that anything fighting them just tries to dodge. And this continues with a 3-person fire team consisting of a Vector operator with Plasma Sniper Rifle, a Unidron with K1 Combi Rifle and Tinbot, and a Nexus Chain of Command. The Nexus is in here kind of on notice, but at 23 points, it's not hugely more expensive than a second Unidron. It counts as a second Unidron, and it gives us that chain of command to be a little bit more liberal with Sheshkin. We can also potentially use the NCO order just to move this fire team around to get the Vector a good line of sight, and then the Vector can absolutely light stuff up. You ideally want to be taking gunfights with the Vector from long ranges because it's got that plasma sniper rage band. But if you do that, you have a model that can very easily stack -12 on many things. Even if it is super jumping up to catch something that your opponent thought couldn't see, if you are catching them in bad range and you are shooting through smoke and the mimetism applies, that -12's basically anything that doesn't have a visor and anything that does have a visor, we have a white noise overdrawn for. And so this is a piece, for example, there's one of the best models in the game at just annihilating vehicles in enemy deployment zones. If you have something like a red eye, for example, that you're trying to fight and put down, you can use super jump on the vector to get into a position where you can draw line of sight, and then that thing has to dodge. And you're firing hit mode plasma sniper rounds that can comfortably one-shot it and then put it down after it goes unconscious. Just a fantastic vehicle hunter, a fantastic everything hunter, frankly. Now it is a single wound piece, and because it's an extra rather, if it takes a wound, it goes straight to dead. But as long as we keep it safe and take only unfair gunfights, it's going to perform really well. In a pinch, if it dies or if it's basically good and it's done its job, we could choose to link this Unidron and the Nexus in with Victor Mesa, just as an alternative way of getting Mesa into the midfield. We might even do something where we just link Mesa with the Unidron. This would be rare, but if we just need to get him into the midfield and the Overdron is staying back and the Vector doesn't need the fire team bonuses anymore, we could just have a situation where it's just another firewall for Mesa to join in. Mostly, we have the firewall Unidron because I had 1 point spare and half an SWC, and a clean 6-300 is aesthetically very pleasing, but just something to consider as an option. Now, the rest of this combat group is a Datarazi and then Orders, 2 Imitrons and an Icadron. There is just 1 Icadron in this list, but we aren't gagging too badly for baggage. It will mostly exist to service Bit and Kiss, and so it'll just deploy near them and then job's done. Combat Group 2 is a Datarazi and a Libertos, so 2 Datarazi in this list. One of them will be pretty dedicated to providing smoke to the extra vector operator. The other is pretty likely to be dedicated to providing smoke to Shashkin, but Datarazi can absolutely kill things by themselves. We then have a Sasha, just as a good quality utility piece. Once Sashas rotate out, you could, for example, cut that Unidron down to a 14.1 and replace the Sasha with a Preta. But for now, Sasha are good value, and just let me spend orders in this combat group going forward and pressing buttons in the midfield, or even performing speculative fire. We've then got an R-drone, we need those repeaters in the deployment zone to do things like defend against flyers, and then Bit and Kiss. Apart from the irregulars, like launching probing attacks or pressing buttons, and the Datarazi throwing smoke, Bit and Kiss are pieces I would expect to spend orders basically every turn from this group, because they will just throw out deployable repeaters with their pitches, and then hunker back down to reload. There's a very realistic world where 2 regular orders every single turn are spent on Bit and Kiss firing off pitches, and then that's all they do for the entire game. They just seed the midfield with repeaters, and that alone would be pretty high value. That enables Victor Mesa, he can do the bulk of the work. Bit and Kiss will ARO, then maybe they'll use Oblivion, they'll use Trinity from time to time, mostly though they are an enabler, and don't forget, Bit has Mine Layer, which gives us that very important 3rd repeater in our deployment zone. 3 is usually the sweet spot in terms of coverage, more is better if you can, but with Bit's deployable repeater and an R-drone and an Icadron, we should be set to cover most of our deployment zone with repeater area, which frees up Messer's mine layer for his cyber mines. We have the Liberto a little bit further forward, and that gives us a very solid close-in defense that our opponent will have to unpick before they do anything like, for example, buzzing us with a flyer. Now, something that is missing from this list and which I would really like to have included but haven't is a puzzler. Puzzlers are probably my favorite profile in the entire game, but this list just refused to come together until I cut, in particular, the expensive MedTech Obsidon, who you need to take in order to take a puzzler. Once you've taken the MedTech, you're really kind of obliged to take 2 Sartroids, otherwise it's not really justifying his points cost, and that entire module ends up being very expensive. Like, I have to cut the entire Overdrawn levels of expensive, and I'm not quite willing to do that unless there is a very specific mission that I'm going to play. For example, I could consider that in something like Achiel Interference. Even then, I'm not 100% sure of it. Overall, though, this is a combined army list that represents one of the first successful attempts I have made to reapproach the faction from first principles, and I'm really keen to play this. Like, I have finished painting and basing my Sheshkin and Victor Mesa, both of which have sat in stages of like 95% completion for like 5 years. That's the level of enthusiasm I have for this list, and it's probably going to feature in a battle report on the channel pretty soon. At which point, I'm very sure I will have encountered one of the weaknesses I didn't hitherto see, or the Vector will just wear an unlikely crit on a 1 sometime on the first turn, and I'll get hella mad, but that's the nature of Infinity. It's a game where we lurch from catastrophe to catastrophe, orienting ourselves as best we can and finding a new direction each time, and ideally this list imposes slightly more casualties on its opponent than it sustains itself. Very excited to play this, because Combined Army have historically been one of my favorite factions in the game. And look, the next iteration of this list or a list like it might even find a way to fit the puzzler back in, but for now, we're stacking heavy visibility mods, shitposter quality hacking, and one of the scariest aggressive lieutenants in the game. And that's gotta accomplish something pretty useful. And with that, we wrap up the video for this evening. Hope very much that you've enjoyed this. This is just a little bit of a reflection back on things I've been excited for since the end of CanCon, with a slightly meandering discussion of the potentially incoming flyer meta along the way. In the comments, let me know, hey, what are you excited to play at the moment? Any of these lists of interest to you? Would you like to see a battle report with any of them? And, if you can keep it civil, how are you currently feeling about flyers in Infinity? Basically, all of us should be at a point now where we've had at least some games against them. And so, where do you feel you are along that kind of growth stage? Have you just had your first game with or against one? Does it feel like it's very, very powerful? Can you see how you might use it better or defend against it better in future? Did it encounter catastrophe or did it perform really well? What's your experience been? Very interested to know. Very interested to know which of these lists you'd like to see featured in a battle report. Overall, though, hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and we will see you next time for more Infinity content.